The Develop menu. Developing allows you all the image adjustment controls that you can possibly need. Sometimes Photoshop gives you a little more or different ways to control them, but basically once you select an image to edit, I have a variety of controls over here, many of which you'll use, some you probably won't. On the left-hand side, you have different options for presets. I tend not to use presets, but you can see in the upper left as I sort of scroll through, it's going to give you kind of automatic functions. You cede some control, but you gain quickness using presets if you want that look. I tend to be a realist in my work, and so I'm usually trying to make it look more real rather than less. I'm usually using the palette on the right-hand side. So again, navigating around this. First off at the top, this is a histogram. I can choose not to see the histogram, but the histogram's of value. A histogram is the tonal values of your image as it is currently. By that, each color image is made up of 3 channels, a red, a green, and a blue channel. They're essentially grayscale or monochrome channels. Each one of those channels is recorded in a histogram mapping the tonal values of your image, 256 shades of gray in each channel, 0 representing black, 255 white. Or maybe those numbers are reversed looking at this, but regardless, 256 shades of gray. Anyway, so this kind of gives you a tonal map. So if everything's off to the left-hand side, that's going to tell you that your image is too dark. So let's just see a function there. Or if everything's off to the right-hand side, you're going to see that it's too light, depending on what you're looking for. And so generally your image will come in and you can make adjustments to exposure, which I'm doing there. And I can partly assess that by the way my image appears, but also looking that you, in most images, will have a spread of tonal values across the histogram, across the graph. So anyway, that's one of the functions here. So some of the basic image adjustment controls, I have white balance, so I can adjust the color temperature. Notice that I have a custom temperature here, but I can present it as shot. I can do auto, which sometimes is great and sometimes it's not. Done a huge shift there. Or daylight, so if I'm shooting in RAW, I have all these different options after I've shot. But in this case, and in many of my photographs, I really have to do some adjustments visually to make those images look right. And so I can do those kind of slider bar things as well. For me, if I'm editing for print, I'll usually do this in tandem with doing test strips and little prints, etc. But some of the other basic image adjustment controls. So I did exposure already. I can add contrast, making the blacks blacker, the whites whiter, forcing those pixels one direction or the other from middle gray, which would be 128. So I can add or subtract contrast or leave it more or less the same. And again, I can make those visual adjustments along with seeing how they impact the histogram. I can take just the highlights in an image and make them lighter or darker. So that's a really great function. Same thing with the shadows. I can take the darker areas, make them lighter, sort of like a fill flash used to do, or make them darker for an even more dramatic look. And if I ever get messed up with these numbers and the slider bar's not always easy with the mouse, I can just need 10, just go in and type the number back in. So that for the highlights and the shadows, but if I want to just take the whites, not just the highlight, but the white areas, I can make the whites lighter or darker, and same thing with the blacks. So again, just want to reset that, just set it back to 0. Use your slider bar. clarity and vibrance, I actually tend to do my sharpening slightly differently. I do use saturation. Most digital images need some boost or uh, reduction in saturation. I usually do it in moderation. I'm usually 11% or less saturated, but the more saturated, the more intense the colors. If you essentially desaturate an image, you're pulling all the color, you're just leaving the tonal values. But again, usually a little boost in saturation is going to help printed images anyway. The tone curve, it's a little more advanced. We'll skip that till later. I also can adjust images by individual hues, making the reds redder or changing their saturation, make the reds more saturate, or luminosity, which is lightness or darkness. Look at the lips, how they radically change. Or you can select to do all of those. I tend to, again, do those in moderation. Same thing with saturation. You can saturate individual colors and not others. Again, I tend to do that in moderation. I'm going to skip split toning for the time being. Sharpening, all digital photographs benefit from sharpening. Again, moderation. You can over sharpen an image. Sharpening increase edge contrast. That's how it gives the appearance of sharpness. If you over sharpen it, it sort of creates a halo around edges, and so it makes edges more distinct in some ways than they should be. I sharpen my images usually about 75% or thereabouts. A radius of 1, which means it's sharpening all the pixels to a moderate amount of detail, and I'm not using any masking. Noise reduction, I tend to use lower ISOs. These are shot often at 400. Uh, tend not to use a lot of noise reduction. Lightroom and Photoshop doesn't always know noise from detail. What they see is pixels that don't quite fit into their surroundings. That means noise to them. Sometimes that's not the case. I prefer to do those other ways. Lens correction, actually, this image isn't going to show that the best, but one thing you always want to do, click on Remove Chromatic Aberration. Chromatic aberration is when you have a lens that focuses different colors on different wavelengths. That means certain colors focus slightly on a different wavelength than others. This is a great tool in Photoshop or in Lightroom, but you can take those layers and realign them. This will do that automatically. It used to be a visual control. This does a better job, and it's easier. Anyway, we'll come back to the adjustments, the transform adjustments here, where you can actually kind of bend your image and that kind of thing. Most of these other things we don't need at that point. And that gives you sort of a basic rundown of particularly the image adjustment controls. My sense is you need those for almost absolutely every image. As you do sharpening and removing chromatic aberration.